If you're considering a career in medicine, this show is for you. I'm going to be talking to a variety of healthcare professionals who are going to share the reality of what it takes to have a successful career in medicine. The good, the bad, the inspiring, the funny. My name is Michelle Neske. I'm a physician assistant and your host, about to bring you Beyond the Scope. If you've done research into applying to physician assistant school, you know how crazy it is with all the different requirements, programs out there, and how do you choose which one is best for you? Well, luckily, two of my friends and PAs created an amazing platform that you can do this all in one place called My PA Box. Research schools by state, track your hours, look up all the requirements, literally in one spot at mypabox.com. You can also use their PA school match to enter in all your demographic information, your GPA, whether or not you took the GRE or PA CAT, and filter for schools that would be the best fit for you. You guys, this has been game changing for pre-PAs, and I use it all the time with my clients. You can go ahead and get a 1-year subscription. And because you're listening to this podcast, if you use Posh PA 15, you can get 15% off your 1-year subscription. You will not regret this. If you are a pre-PA, it will sort things out so much for you and just make it easier to do the research on the programs that are the best fit for you. So check them out, mypabox.com. Hey, you guys, welcome to Beyond the Scope. I'm super excited to talk to Dr. Rick Barrett today, otherwise known as RickyRick.PhD on TikTok and Instagram. Just a little bit of background is that Dr. Barrett started his research career as a research diver and marine biologist at Florida Atlantic University studying sea turtles. Oh my God. During his master's, he was introduced to biomedical sciences through a project screening marine natural products for therapeutic compounds. As his research interest evolved, he left the sea, as so happens in evolution, and decided to pursue biomedical research full-time for his PhD in biomedical sciences and immunology. During his PhD, he studied how the immune system can influence metabolism. Currently, Rick works as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania, where he studies tumor microenvironment and immunity. More specifically, his group looks at how cancer cells are able to manipulate the healthy cells around a tumor to promote growth and suppress immunity. He works with a variety of collaborators in both academia and industry to bring new cancer therapeutics to market and is currently supported by a T32 grant from the NIH. You guys, this is amazing. First of all, because you know I'm in oncology and I'm a cancer geek, and so is he. So I'm really excited to talk to him a little bit more about how he went the PhD route and what that looks like. And then also about, his research specifically and his exponential growth on social media and how he's sharing everything with us. So I'm super excited. Here is Dr. Barrett. Okay, so Dr. Barrett is here. Welcome. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So you are a PhD, but that's not necessarily how you started off. Did you know you wanted to be a PhD?
So I think I knew I wanted to be a PhD, but what I was actually going to be a PhD in was just certainly up for discussion throughout my whole training. I just knew I wanted to be a scientist and didn't exactly know what that looked like, and just kept going until, I found something that fit me. So.
Were you always interested in science, like as a kid, or is your family in medicine or science?
No, nothing in my family was really on the science side. I kind of came into it I always enjoyed it as a kid. I more wanted to be an explorer as a kid. My heroes were like Jacques Cousteau, who invented scuba, and some of the people like that who are going around the world and doing exciting things. And so that's kind of where I came into it. And that's how I entered science, really, is through the marine biology side. I'm born and raised in Florida. And so I was always around the ocean. And I think as many kids have had the thought before, being a marine biologist would be awesome, And so that's kind of where I had started. And so
So where
introduced
in
myself to
Florida?
science. So I was born in Orlando and spent, most of my childhood there, and then spent a lot of time in South Florida. That's where I went to do my undergrad and my
Yeah.
master's. And so kind of between Central and South Florida a good bit.
Okay. So I spent some time, lived in Miami for 5 years. Um,
All right.
yeah, my husband is a surgeon and he did his ENT residency at Jackson Memorial. So we were in Miami for a while and
Mm.
they had that. I mean, I can't imagine a better place to want to explore marine biology than South Florida.
Yes, yes. So, and that's why I went down there partially. And so even as a kid, I was worried about like taking on debt or anything like that. And so
Mhm.
I had one small scholarship coming out of high school, but I was certainly not a rock star student. I was kind of just get my B's and get through school. And that was
Okay.
kind of how I did it. And so Florida Atlantic University, I had applied to a few, and Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton wasn't as well known as many other universities, but they had they're 1 to 2 miles from the ocean, and had a good marine biology program. And because they were trying to build the school a bit and get better students in and continually grow, they offered me a scholarship as well. And so I decided to go to, if you want to look at it that way, a lower tier university. So that way I wasn't going to build up any debt, and it was going to be easier for me. And the programs that I wanted to look into were, there and doing well. And so that's why I went to Florida Atlantic University. And I really enjoyed my time there, my whole undergrad. Um,
Yeah.
I even in college, I wasn't the most amazing student. I was still, whatever I did in high school, I just kind of continued in college and got my B's, maybe bumped it up to a B plus student.
Okay.
And, but, really tried to set myself apart with what I did outside of the
Mhm.
classroom. And so whether that
Okay.
being working in labs or, becoming a member and participating in different other school functions that were available.
Okay. So yeah, I think that's important for people. So not everybody's a straight A student, right? So important to know that if you're thinking, that you want to be a scientist, that, there are many different paths people can take. So you got your undergraduate degree and then you got your master's degree at the same place or you went somewhere else?
I got my master's at the same place.
Okay.
And one thing that a lot of people don't really think about is that you can actually go straight from an undergrad to a PhD program, right after you
Okay.
finish your bachelor's. You don't have to get a master's degree along the way. A lot of people think there's that sequential order, but there isn't. And a lot of the people I did my PhD with hadn't done a master's degree beforehand. It is a
Okay.
good way to kind of boost yourself a little bit. If you didn't have the best undergrad, and you want to get
Yeah.
into a PhD program that you maybe think's a little out of your league from what your credentials were, a master's degree is a good way to kind of do that, I think. And so that's partially
Yeah.
what I had done. I had also started some research in my undergrad that I wanted to continue
Mhm.
doing. And then the unscientific reason is FAU had just built an on-campus football stadium, and I wanted to have a few a few seasons, at that. All my friends were still there, and so I can't say it was purely a career decision, but
That's
it was
awesome.
mostly a career decision. And so
So,
yeah, in my
so
undergrad, I had gone. Yeah, go ahead.
no, so I was gonna say if you were somebody that was gonna do a PhD from undergrad, what does that look like? Like, do you start that in that process in your undergrad, or do you kind of graduate
So
and
yeah,
then do that?
there's a couple ways that you can do it. The most important thing I think for people looking to go into a PhD program or be working in research is to do research, right? You
Mm-hmm.
can't, I mentioned that I was not the best student, but I was a B plus student. You still need to do well in your coursework. If
Mm-hmm.
you're not doing well in your coursework, you're just not going to get
Yeah.
into a PhD program. It's going to be difficult to find work. They do look at your grades. And it's important to show that you're able to master the basic concepts of biology. That said, as long as you're doing well, the next most important thing by far is to do research. And so if you want to go
Mm-hmm.
straight from bachelor's into PhD or any route you do, it's important to take advantage of what you have at a university, which is the labs that are around you and to volunteer in those labs. Everybody wants you to have experience, but experience doesn't necessarily mean that you're paid for it, right? If you're paying for school, that's negative income there. And so free, free education and free experience is certainly a little bit better than that. Yeah. And so I highly recommend people throughout your entire undergrad, and it's never too early to start. If you can find a position as a freshman, I would, do it then. And, but I started my junior year kind of at the end of that. And as I mentioned before, I was in the marine biology kind of track. Right. People always ask me, oh, what major? Is it better for me to do genetics or biochem or molecular biology? Right. As long as you have a good core foundation in biology, the major is not nearly as important as people think. And it surprises me how much focus people put on their exact major. I would just go with whatever is a good major at your university, whatever they're putting the most time and energy behind the university, they're likely to put the time and energy behind you if you're in that major. And so what the actual degree isn't nearly as important as people think, because I obviously came from marine biology, which is about as far away from the cancer research I do now as you can in the biology space.
I agree with you. I get that question all the time. What should my major be? I want to pick the right major. I'm like, there isn't a right major. You pick the major that you're interested in, and that will get you the prereqs you need if you're thinking of going to medical school or PA or, PhD or whatever it is. But, there's no one that's better than another. It's just, I try to encourage people to pick what they enjoy so that they can, excel in it or do as best as they can.
Yes. And the way to really, I think, set yourself apart, as I keep saying, is the research, right? And so if you could, as long as you take your core biology classes, if you've been in a lab and been doing research, that really says a lot about you, because that's not something the university does for you. That's something you have to go out and do yourself. And it's not an easy thing to always set up. Not every lab can take volunteers. Not every lab wants to take volunteers. And so you often have to reach out to, 5 or 10 labs before you finally find somebody. And so that's something that I think is really valuable. And, I'll briefly talk about my experience with it. In my undergrad, I started in sea turtle research. And so that's what I was, working on at the time. And then moved into
that's
natural
so great.
products chemistry.
There's so many, there's a huge sea turtle hospital here.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That's awesome.
And South Florida has a lot of
I'm in Charleston, so we have a huge.
But the natural products.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that was great, and I really enjoyed doing that. But as I started to kind of continue on with my classes, I really became interested in the biochemistry and chemistry much more than I ever expected to. And so as I went on into kind of the end of my undergrad and master's, I started doing natural products chemistry, where we'd go out to the ocean. I was a research diver for FAU, a scuba diver. And we collect coral and sponges and algae, and we would take them back to the lab, extract the compounds they made, and then screen them for their therapeutic value, for therapeutic leads to design new medicines out of. And so that was kind of my transition from that marine biology space into a more medical type space. And that was why I stayed at FAU, because I started that end of my undergrad and wanted to just kind of see it through into my master's and keep doing that work. And so that was kind of how I came to those decisions and how I transitioned from one science to the other.
That's awesome. And so when you say you have to reach out to like 5 or 10 labs, I think that's important because, like you said, it's not always easy to find these opportunities, and people ask, how do you find somebody for this? So how do you approach people that you want to be, you're interested in being a volunteer in their research lab, or how do you even find those people?
Yeah, for finding people, and this is another area where people, I think, focus on what is the title of the research a little bit too much. I think it's more important, especially at the undergrad level, or even at the grad school level, that you're finding good mentors first and foremost. That's the most important thing for you to worry about. Is this somebody who is actually going to be in the lab. And we refer to them as PIs, which is principal investigator, because that's just the line that they fill out on the grant. And so find a good PI, find a good advisor that's going to be there in the lab, that's not too busy to actually mentor you. And it doesn't matter if it's not the exact field that you want to go into. You're going to spend years just learning how to set up experiments, conduct them, think about problems. And you're going to learn so much more after you finish school that what you actually learn in school is going to feel like such a small part of what you know. And so I worry about finding a good mentor first and foremost, and then the actual research, whether it's exactly what you want to do or not, that's not nearly as important at that stage.
Yeah, so I was a genetics and molecular biology. That's my degree. And so my first job out of college was as a research assistant in a lab, at the Dana-Farber. And I really wasn't necessarily looking for a cancer research job, but I liked the physician. Like I liked him a lot. He was a younger guy, MD, PhD, started this lab, was the PI, of some trials, and taught me a lot about, not only just how to do experiments, but, about interpreting them and how that, eventually may lead to future therapeutics and things like that. So finding a great mentor like that, I mean, he wound up being my mentor for a variety of reasons, even when I switched over to PA on the more clinical side. But I think that's a very important point, is finding somebody that, can kind of, the growth after you graduate college is so exponential in so many ways. So I think finding somebody that can help you get there and live with your mistakes in my particular case. But, just kind of show you the ropes is super important than focusing on what the actual research is.
Yeah, and you might get lucky the first time, and the first person you reach out to takes you in their lab and they're a great mentor. That's kind of, there's a little luck involved there. Or it may take a couple times. Not every lab I got into was a great experience for my growth as a scientist. They weren't necessarily bad. But it's important to keep that in mind as well, that, the first one or two labs you get into, that's perfectly normal, that, maybe even if you guys are both good people and you're doing decent work, that, the communication styles may not be the same, or, something may be a little off. And it's important to recognize that. And if that's not a good setting for you, to move to another setting where you think you'll be able to get a little better experience out of it. So don't be discouraged. Everyone I work with, everyone I know has had an experience where they've ended up in a lab that just wasn't necessarily a good fit for whatever reason. And so that's not, as much to worry about, as long as you're willing to make the decision to get to a new place where it is going to be a good fit. And so that's something, we kind of all deal with.
Yeah, I completely agree. So let's transition a little bit into now how you transitioned into your current research. Sort of tell us a little bit about how you made that transition, and really what you love about this field in particular. Because if you guys follow Dr. Barrett on TikTok, he has some amazing TikToks that explain immunity and cancer cells and all of these things in very simple layman's terms that we can understand, which is extremely helpful. But how did you sort of wind up in this area, and where do you see yourself going with it?
Yeah, so I guess the transition, so that'll be a transition from my master's to where I am now, kind of all that space in between. And I guess that's a good time to talk about some of the tougher things that you'll go through in trying to become a scientist or going through this field. My master's degree was the first time I'd experienced funding shortages, right? And so the state of Florida, I had this great project set up doing what I explained, taking these compounds from the ocean, testing them for therapeutic value in a neuroscience space. We were looking for neuroprotective compounds that could protect the brain during a stroke or help people heal from those kind of issues. and loved the project. Everything was going great, was, starting to put together my thesis. And then the state of Florida had a big state budget cut, and FAU took a pretty big cut from that. And so one of the labs I was working with actually had to move to a new location. And so all of a sudden, just, in a matter of a week, my entire project fell apart. And I ended up having to drop the thesis and just try to get the master's done in time. And so that was my first time like, oh man, research is kind of at the whims of where the money comes from sometimes.
Yeah.
And luckily I was able to finish on time my master's without the thesis though. And I had applied to University of California, San Diego. They have a campus out there called Scripps Institute of Oceanography. And it's like the mecca for marine research, one of the top places in the world. I never thought I would get in there or even be looked at, but I had actually found one professor I liked there and written him handwritten notes and mailed them through, snail mail so that he would notice me. And eventually he did. And we started talking back and forth. And I actually got a invite to go out and interview at Scripps. And I was ecstatic. This has been like my dream place to be. I couldn't believe it. And so they flew me out, paid for everything, put us up on the beach. I felt so out of place because 4 of us were flown out to do this interview. It was me, 1 student from Harvard, and then 2 students from Berkeley. And I was from FAU, just sitting there like, all right, I don't know how I got here, but happy to be here.
Wow.
And had a good time. I talked to the professor. He said, it's a good match. We want you on our lab. These are the projects we'll have you working on. And I just went home completely ecstatic, really stoked about it. And a few weeks after that, this was 2013, the federal sequester went into effect, which was, if nobody was paying attention to the federal government at that time, the Congress wasn't able to vote on a budget. They weren't able to pass a budget. And so this automatic cut in spending went into effect, which was a 7% cut across all of the federal budget. And that included the NIH, National Institute of Health, National Science Foundation, all of that. And the lab that was going to take me lost 2 of their biggest grants that were going to fund my education. And so I got a phone call and said, hey, we no longer can take you. Nothing we can do in a discussion. Bye. And so I was like devastated at that point. It was too late for me to apply anywhere else. My dream school, I couldn't get into all of a sudden. So I didn't know what to do. I had nothing to do. I was graduating, had nothing lined up. And so I was determined to get out to San Diego and try to find something. So I sold everything I had, put everything else in the back of my little pickup truck and drove out to California and spent a year just kind of working odd jobs. Luckily, some friends helped me out. Luckily, the lab put me in contact with one of their old students who had started a startup biotech, and I met with him just to talk, and he was nice enough to give me an internship. And so I worked at a company called Serenus Marine Discovery. And so that was a good experience, got me, wasn't a full wasted year. And then I did another round of applying for the next year, sent applications out to multiple schools, and the funding environment was still tough. And the only one that was willing to accept me was UCF, University of Central Florida.
Okay.
So I loaded everything back in the truck again, went back across country, and I was taking anything I could get. Like I said, just wanted to be a scientist at this point. And so I kind of dropped the marine component off there because I had been accepted to UCF's medical school to do a PhD, which I was very happy about. So I went there, and that's where I did my PhD. And so that was kind of the introduction to that.
Wow. That, I think it's really important for people to understand, though, about funding. So basically, as a scientist and in research, you apply for NIH funding to support your research. And it's a process, y'all. I mean, it's like, grant writing is no simple task. My husband had a K08, and, I've been through the grant writing process, seeing him do the grant writing process, and a K-12 and K-08 and all these different things, and some other thing he has now. They have all different letters, and it's a process, and you don't know if you're getting the money or not, right? So it's always up in the air. It's never guaranteed.
And that's another thing that, you hope as a student, you're protected from that. If you have a good mentor, a good advisor who knows how funding works, knows how to write grants and all of that. You hope to never see that side. If everything goes well, they get the funding and they just pay you. And that's another thing that's probably pretty important to mention for a PhD. Everybody always makes the joke, I mentioned it took me 10 and a half years of college to get my doctorate.
Yeah.
Everyone's like, oh God, I can't imagine the amount of debt you have, as a doctor. I actually have no debt. I graduated with $0 in debt.
Wow, that's amazing.
I taught during the master's to pay for that. So I taught at the school. I had those scholarships for undergrad that helped, and I worked, I think, 4 jobs during that 6-year period at once.
Yeah.
And then for the PhD, what a lot of people don't realize is that if you do a STEM PhD, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, all that, it's paid for in the US. In fact, you get paid to do that PhD.
Wow.
It's amazing that, and I guess I didn't really know that until I started, looking into PhD programs.
Right.
But the way it works is most PhDs are set up on average, and there's a lot of disparity between universities, but generally they operate off of a general framework, which is a PhD is 5 to 6 years. And so the first 2 years are very much just like a master's degree. You're doing your coursework, you come in, you all start together, do your coursework. At the end of those, during those 2 years, you're considered a PhD student. And that's kind of, where everyone's doing the traditional degree kind of things that you can think of. At the end of those 2 years, you'll usually have some sort of transition into this new part of the degree where you're a PhD candidate, and you're not doing any schoolwork, not taking any tests, nothing to classroom related. In that time period, you're strictly doing research. And there's usually exit exams or, some sort of proposal you have to submit. There's some sort of benchmark at that 2-year point, and it's different for every university. That is the transition. And if you're not going to make it as a PhD student, that's usually the stopping point. The university will identify you, say, hey, you're not keeping up with everything, or we don't think this is going to work. And that way you at least get a master's degree out of that because you've finished those 2 years of work. And so that way it's not a waste of your time. But when you go into this research period, you're doing work for the school, right? You're doing research for a professor. And even if you're not doing that full time, you're probably teaching or running a class. And so you're bringing value to the university, and they pay you for that. And so an average 5-year PhD program, you're going to get a full tuition waiver. And so you don't pay any tuition, and you should be getting a stipend that will vary based on what subject you're on. Usually medical or biomedical is going to be one of the higher ones, and it can be $24,000 to $30,000 a year that they're paying you. And that's, paying you for the work that you're doing in the lab. You're expected to show up just like a regular job. And some of the other, programs may have a little bit less. So that varies widely, and it's something to ask your PhD program. But there's, if you don't have any other expenses, it's certainly difficult with the family. We had, people who were supporting a family, with their significant other working as well. And that's more difficult. But if it's just you and you're able to live, humbly during that time, there's no reason why you wouldn't be able to get through without taking any debt whatsoever. And so that's something that, and also because of that, they take a lot less people, right? UCF is a good example. I think they took something like 120 med students every year, and usually 12 to 16 PhD students. And so because they have to pay you, they need to have a space for you in a lab to actually work. And they're going to take a lot less people because of that, because it's a financial burden for them to take you as a student.
Okay. Wow. That's really good to know, though. I mean, having no debt. I mean, that's very unheard of in terms of medical careers. So, that's great. And so when you say you're a postdoctoral fellow, so what does that mean? So you finished your PhD.
Yes. So you'll finish the PhD, and it's kind of the research version of a residency that an MD would go through. More people have probably seen Grey's Anatomy than any show with a PhD in it. And so that's maybe an easier comparison for people to go with. And so for an MD would finish their degree, and you can go get a job if you want that's not practicing medicine per se. There's medical science liaison, all these different types of jobs that you can do with a doctorate without doing any further training. But if you want to go the traditional route, an MD needs to do a residency, which is their real intensive hands-on training, kind of their
Yeah.
first job. It's still considered a trainee position. And for PhDs, you can do the same thing. You can either, go on into industry or something and do a non-traditional job, or if you want to go and really stay, intensive in the research, you do your postdoctoral fellowship, which is very similar to a residency, but on the research side. And so I originally wanted to bail out and just go into industry, work at a biotech.
Yeah.
I was kind of done with hands-on research. I had a good experience, but I just wasn't, enchanted by it during my PhD.
Right.
And so that was my plan. During my PhD at UCF, though, I've been very hands-on because, like I said, I was never a rock star student. So I was used to always doing extracurricular type things.
Yeah.
And I had been on a planning committee for a lot of the conferences and symposiums that we were throwing. And near the end, so as I was finishing my PhD, I was helping organize a big conference there. And I always met with visiting professors every chance I got, whether they were in my field, whether it was a good career decision, no matter what. If I got the opportunity to meet with a visiting professor, I took it just so I could get better at talking science and to just to meet people, to get an idea of what all the fields were like. No matter what, I took that. And I recommend people do that as well. Your university, is hopefully bringing in scholars to visit and giving that opportunity to students, no matter what, whether you see a clear value in it or not, take it and do that.
Yeah.
And so the keynote speaker at the conference that I was organizing, we went out to dinner with all of us organizers. She was a professor here at Penn, a very world-renowned cancer biologist. I had nothing to do with cancer in my PhD, by the way. I was pure. I did immunometabolism research, so studying how the immune system and cellular metabolism interact with each other and regulate each other. And so nothing cancer at all. But she was an interesting person. So we went to dinner, talked, stayed in touch after that because I had some cells in our lab that we were going to send to her for her research. And this whole time I didn't want to stay in academia, wanted nothing to do with it, wanted to go work at a cool company. But after being in touch for a while, I knew that she worked with different biotechs and pharmaceuticals as, consulting or helping them with research or helping them discover new drugs. So I just asked her for advice and she said, how about you come do a postdoc with me? And so I was kind of taken aback, didn't ask for a job or anything. And I said, I don't know, I'm not huge on academia. She's like, well, I tell you what, we'll fly you up, pay for everything, we'll interview. And so that way it's no risk to you. And I'm like, all right, free trip to Philly. I've never even seen an Ivy League campus before. And so it'd be cool to go look at an Ivy League school and, walk around all fancy. I don't know what happens, but I just, like free trip, let's do it. And so came up here and didn't expect to, but immediately just fell in love with Penn. I'm a surfer kid from Florida. And so the Ivy League schools just seemed scary to me. And I figured everybody would be like mean and intense and all that. And it just wasn't the case at all at Penn. I met with, I'm just a visiting PhD student at the time. I hadn't even finished my defense yet. And they had physicians from the hospital taking time out to meet with me one-on-one for an hour out of their day, talking. I gave presentations. They were super nice about it, asked me about the research. All of her collaborators, you can tell they've just been friends for a long time. And, it just really, it kind of caught me off guard almost. And I just kind of fell in love with Penn and the research environment here. And so without realizing it, I, took the job and I played a little hardball. I've never heard of anyone doing this before, but I actually negotiated a moving package for a trainee position.
Yes.
And I didn't know what I was doing, but I kind of threw it out there. And so she paid for me to move. And so for the third time, I sold everything I owned, put it in the back of my pickup truck, and I drove. I've had the same
I was going to say, do you have the same car?
I've had the same one since I was 15. So I've had that truck for 16 years almost now.
Wow. That's amazing.
And so, drove up here and that's where I've started here. And so it's technically a trainee position.
Yeah.
You get paid well. The NIH, the National Institute of Health, they fund most of the medical research across all of the United States. And so you'll hear NIH funding a lot, and that's because they're the main funder. And so the averages for the NIH for a postdoc, everybody pays on the NIH pay scale, because if you're paying with NIH money, you need to follow the rules. And so a first year postdoc will make around 50 to 52,000 now. They just raised it. And so it's, not that bad. And
Yeah.
especially for a PhD, you didn't accrue debt during that time you're doing your
Right.
PhD. Whereas if you're doing a residency as an MD, 60,000, I think, is kind of where they start, 60,
Yeah.
62, something like
Hmm.
that, which is better, but you also have $250,000 in debt
Yeah.
probably. And so I'm
Exactly.
perfectly fine doing my research,
Yeah.
and I haven't had any trouble living off of it. It's not been an issue. And you just do research full time. You're a
Yeah.
trainee, so everybody's super willing to help you. They kind of
Yeah.
help. And now I have my own funding, so I'm not even
That's
dependent
great.
on my
Yeah.
boss. I have a T32 grant, which is a
Hmm.
grant for trainees from the National Institute of Health.
Hmm.
And that's important to me too, because I've been at the mercy
Yeah.
of my advisor's funding for so long and kind of been tossed around because of that. Securing my own funding certainly is a nice feeling. So no matter what happens to her, Ellen, she would never lose funding. She's very well funded, but
Yeah.
God forbid something did happen and we lost a grant, I can continue to
Right.
pay my own salary and do whatever work I want.
That's great. And so how long do you stay in this position?
So it depends. If you want
Hmm.
to go into a research position in industry, a lot of people will
Hmm.
do 1 to 2 years. It doesn't need to
Okay.
be incredibly long. They just like that experience.
Yeah.
If you want to get a professorship somewhere or start the tenure track process, it tends to be longer because you need to really
Okay.
establish your body of work, publish
Hmm.
papers, and establish yourself as an expert in the field. And
Yeah.
so 4 to 5 years is typical
Hmm.
for this postdoc position. And the good news is you get a raise every year. That's built into the
Right.
NIH's
Okay.
program. So there's
Yeah.
about a 3% raise built in every year. And so if you're
Okay.
doing good work and they keep renewing your postdoc every year, you'll
Hmm.
see that increase. And so, yeah, 4 to 5 years is average. I'm still unsure. I'm having
Yeah.
so much fun just doing the research now. I still, even coming here, I still plan to
Yeah.
go into, a cool startup biotech company or something like
Yeah.
that. But the more I work here, the more I just love the research I'm doing.
Hmm.
And so I don't even really care to move on right now. I'm just having fun doing the research, and I,
Yeah.
just want to publish the papers, and I'll worry about the rest later. And so I've
Yeah.
had recruiters contact me and stuff, and I've told them like, hey, I'll get back to you guys whenever I,
When
feel
I'm,
like I'm done with this research.
yeah. And so
So.
you're basically doing cancer therapeutic immunology research right now, right?
Yes. And so, as I mentioned, I had no cancer background, but with the
Right.
explosion in cancer immunotherapy as a field,
Hmm.
it's really considered the next wave in cancer treatment. And so,
Yeah.
back in the old days, the only option you had was to cut cancer out, surgery.
Yes.
And then, they had radiation and chemo finally came. That was the first time we could treat cancers that you couldn't do surgery on. And so that was a massive breakthrough. But nothing really came, after that for a while. We just got better at those techniques we already had. But
Hmm.
now, thanks to work from people like Jim Allison and some others who really did a lot of work to show that the immune system can recognize cancer, because that's a really revolutionary thought at the time, because the immune
Hmm.
system isn't supposed to recognize self,
Right.
right? It's supposed to
Hmm.
ignore any cell that's you, otherwise you cause major issues like autoimmune disease. And so
Right.
selling the idea that the immune system's capable of recognizing cancer cells, which are technically self, it took them a lot of work. But
Yeah.
they created this whole new field that is cancer immunotherapy, where we basically are designing drugs to help the immune system recognize cancer and,
Hmm.
kind of defeat it on its own, with our help. And so that's why I kind of transitioned into this space. Cancer is looking for a lot of immunologists right now,
Yeah.
because the cancer biologists didn't necessarily have great traditional training in immunology. It's a
Right.
very complex field. And so a lot of fields are coming together to answer
Hmm.
these questions. And so that's kind of how I made that
Yeah.
transition into this space.
So yeah, I mean, I've been a PA in oncology for 15 years, and when I started, there was no such thing as
Yep.
immunotherapy at the time. It was chemotherapy and radiation therapy or surgery, but then there were
Mm-hmm.
also these newer drugs that were targeted therapies. So, you know, um, basically oral drugs targeting specific mutations within tumors that cause them to grow. Those were sort
Mm-hmm.
of the new drugs on the block at that time. And those drugs have evolved immensely over the last 10 years. But in the last 2 years, I would
Mm-hmm.
say immunotherapy has not only changed the landscape of cancer treatment across the board, not just one tumor type, but
Mm-hmm.
has changed the way we practice clinically. And also, basically, we now have long term survivors that we didn't have before. So just to understand both sides, the impact of immunotherapy is having on the scientific world and translating into clinical medicine is something I've I've never seen before, and I think a lot of
Yeah.
people have never seen before. So it's a super interesting field to be doing research in at this moment. So that's awesome.
Yeah, and it's going to grow outside of the cancer space as well.
Oh
There's a
yeah.
lot of people at Penn, looking at how can we take some of these techniques we've developed in cancer. And we spend so much money, the taxpayers, people donating, charities, all this stuff on cancer research. And a lot of people wonder, is it worth it to put this much money into, one disease space? But a lot of the things that we discover in cancer actually end up being used in other diseases because, whenever we're studying cancer, we have to understand how these different cell types are communicating so intimately and in so much detail that we very often find things, oh, we discovered something here. And we know this pathway is also messed up in this disease. And so a lot of drugs that were originally developed for cancer to disrupt or, influence different ways that cells are communicating, end up getting used in a lot of other disease spaces. And that's the same thing that's happening with immunotherapy now. The massive jump forward we've done in understanding how the immune system is interacting in these spaces has been used in so many other disease spaces like autoimmune diseases. And even now we're actually leveraging, our research was kind of ramped down to only essential work because of this current quarantine we're in. And the only research that is currently exempt from that is obviously coronavirus research.
Right.
And so we've actually been leveraging all of the advancements we've made in understanding how, we study a lot about how lung and pancreatic cancer, how the healthy cells react to the damage from the cancer, how they influence the immune system and its response to kill the cancer. But a lot of those reactions of a healthy body to that damage, we are now taking and applying to coronavirus. And so we'll start work. Actually, once I get off this call, I'm going to start putting a lot of the stuff together and start work this week and next, where we'll be taking in lungs from coronavirus patients and looking at a lot of the things that we know to look for in, lung cancer, how the lungs are responding, the damage, what the immune system's doing, and look at that in that space now. And that allows us to go back to work and actually leverage, the knowledge that we've developed in cancer into an infectious disease space. And so it's going to be a really interesting project,
really
I think.
Interesting. Yeah.
To bring some of that knowledge to a new space.
Yeah. I mean, that's the absolute most amazing part about combining science, the basic science with the medical side. I think people sometimes only see what they see on Grey's Anatomy, like you said. And, there's just so much that goes on behind the scenes, with research and science. And so I love that you're talking to us about this today and bringing some light into this area. But then also let's talk very briefly about your TikTok because, he is so big on TikTok, and I'm telling you right now, I watch his videos and I'm like, oh my God, that's so helpful. I'm going to share that to my Instagram. And so what do you kind of see yourself doing with this platform now that so many people know Rick, the PhD?
Yeah, I certainly didn't expect it to get that big. I think I'm just over, between Instagram and TikTok, I'm just over 140,000 followers now, which is a lot more than I ever expected. And it was just a way for me, kind of coming up through the channels I did. Most of my friends weren't scientists, and PhDs are kind of hard to meet to begin with. Everybody knows a doctor, a physician, because you have to go see them, right? Right. Everybody needs one. Nobody interacts with scientists, which is a difficult part of breaking into the field, obviously. So most of my friends were just, like my regular friends I made at college and didn't know anything about science. And so by hanging out with, people who aren't science-based, I got a little better at trying to explain what I did. And so I could gauge, I got a lot of blank stares in the beginning. And eventually I started to realize, okay, these are not words that normal people are familiar with. And I got better at kind of gauging, how to explain things. And then through, I mentioned in my master's, I taught at the university, and that's how I paid for my master's. I got a tuition waiver and a small stipend on top of that. And I was just teaching, a lab section as lead TA. but I kind of really enjoyed it. I hate grading, but I loved the teaching part.
Right.
And then even the first year of my PhD, I taught a section of human physiology as well.
Okay.
And so I kind of missed that. And so I just took to social media just to share what I was doing, especially now I'm doing just research. I just show up to the lab, and that's my whole career right now.
Yeah.
And so I just liked to share things. You kind of get complacent in what you're doing in a lab, and you forget, okay, I'm about to take a gene that was taken out of a jellyfish for a protein that glows in the dark and put it into a human cell so that I can follow it as it interacts, with something over here. And, at its face value, when you're working every day, it's moving something that looks like water into another vial that looks like water, and then you shake it and you put it in. But when you stop and think about what you're doing, it's truly amazing.
Cool.
And so I found sharing this stuff on social media that people really enjoyed it. And I enjoyed it as well, because it reminded me how exciting what I'm doing is, because it's easy to forget that on the day to day. And so that's just what I did. And I had nobody cared for a long time, years. I had maybe 1,000 followers, which is a decent amount, but, and it was a blessing, because once you start getting a lot of followers, you get all sorts of interesting responses to what you're doing. And so it's nice to start with a smaller amount so that you can kind of hone your craft and learn how to explain things. And, I had quite a few years under my belt of just sharing my science and sharing scientific ideas before it started to kind of exponentially grow. And so I'm thankful I had that time in the beginning. Because, you forget, you speak with scientists. And so when you share an idea, you generally know how those people are going to react to it. When you're speaking to a random collection of a few thousand people from the population, you don't know how people are going to react. Everyone has different backgrounds, and a lot of times it's through no fault of their own. They grew up in the environment they grew up in, and were only taught certain things. And some people are excited to learn new things, and some people see it, kind of as sometimes take a little offense to it, because that's not how they were taught. And so it's important to be patient and understand where other people are coming from. And I tried to not take a stance of, oh, you're ignorant that you don't believe this. Just trust me, I'm a scientist. And, because it's easy to do that. And I think a lot of times people do take the cop out and say, here's my degree, trust me, and it's just not a good approach. I've found. I've never changed anyone's mind that way. So, on my social media, I always try, people ask me questions and say, is there a hidden cure to cancer? I think there is. And I say, listen, if you're not trained in what cancer is, how it works and all this, that's actually a pretty normal viewpoint for people to have, given the information they've been given. And so you can't get mad at people for thinking that per se. You have to understand this is just the way the information's been presented to them. Can I present this in a way that they'll understand? And I've had a lot of luck with that. It takes patience for sure, but I've been able to change a lot of minds and hopefully open people's eyes a little bit more and kind of, nip a few conspiracies in the bud before they,
yes. So, one of the things that, that was interesting when I went on TikTok, I didn't see anybody like me on there. I didn't see any PAs or, anybody who was doing even on PA in oncology or anything like that. And I thought it was an opportunity to kind of share with people what I did and why I do it, how I did it, and I think it's really a great platform to do that. And, I would say, I don't see a lot of other PhDs on TikTok. And so I think just even that, just exposing people to a profession like this, and then on the next level, doing the teaching is going to reach a lot of people and make people interested in science and in PhD and in cancer research and things like that. I get that a lot too on the clinical side. Are we ever going to cure this? It's not that simple, and I take for granted sometimes what people understand about their own cancer when I see them. And so, you really have to adjust your thinking and the way you talk to people so that they can understand it. I think you do a great job at that. And so it's a great platform to be able to do that. Now, I will say this, when some people in the medical field are like, think of PhDs, they think of sort of hermits, like these people that are just like in the lab,
Yeah.
like really quiet or a little awkward. And they're just like, doing all the cancer research. So I think that's the other awesome thing is that like, you're not like that, right? So just showing people that that's not the, sort of, I guess, what's the word I'm starting to say? It's not the impression that everybody should be the same. So, but in the medical arena, I do see that as a bias sometimes.
Yeah. And it's certainly, it's not a completely unwarranted bias. It tends to be the science people tend to, just that field tends to attract people that
Yeah.
like to just do their work and maybe not have as many personal interactions. But the thing I love about science more than anything is it's just such an eclectic assortment of people. I mean, just all sorts of people that, I mean, more than any other career I've seen, it's just, from people from all over the world, the other postdocs I work with directly in my lab are from China and Iran and the UK.
Yes.
And so that is one mix there. There's people who are very shy and very kind of, what everyone would consider strange personalities, and they're kind of weird. And those are some of my favorite people because they're just, they think about things in a way you could never predict. And they're some of my favorite people to work with a lot of the times. And there's a lot of people with different disabilities, just because that diverse way of thinking and it's just very stimulating to a scientific environment. And so that's what you want. That's what we need. And I think, science as a whole, at least, the biological sciences are doing a much better job of kind of making sure we, build up that diversity even more, because it's my favorite part. And so,
I mean, and I think it's great. It just adds, out of the box thinking. People have different points of view, and like you said, it's people all over the world. I think about the research lab I was in, and we had people from Japan and India and, all these different places that brought a different experience and different ideas that just in the end stimulate other people's ideas. So it's really cool to be in that situation. So,
and that's, what I try to show people with, what I'm doing on social media is I found it very hard because, like you said, in general, it is a more kind of, closed off society. I guess you think of the science people, they don't get out and interact with people as much on the whole. So I found it very difficult to meet scientists or to talk to scientists, or, most careers you try to network your way in. That's very difficult in science sometimes, unless you're just doing science. And so I naturally just do what I share on social media, get a lot of questions, career type questions. And so I try to, guide people in the right direction and help them out a little bit. You can save people a lot of times with just a few little tidbits of advice maybe they didn't think of. So
well, that's awesome. Listen, I really appreciate you taking the time to share all of this with my listeners and just shed the light on being a scientist and a PhD, what all that takes, and how you're making a difference in medicine being on the non-clinical side. I think it's super important. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being here. You guys can follow Dr. Barrett. It's rickyrick.phd, right? On both platforms, on TikTok and Instagram. So be sure to head over and do that. Amazing videos. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I had a great time talking.
Thank you. Have a good one. Bye.